My name is Taylor Lovett. I am the VP of Engineering at a company called 10up. I'm a WordPress plugin creator, a core contributor to WordPress, as well as other open source projects, and just an open source community member. I always have to add this slide, as Mustafa knows. My company 10up is hiring. We are the biggest WordPress-centric agency in the world. We're a remote company, so we hire people from all over the world, PHP developers, front-end engineers, designers, really anybody who's passionate about open source and looking for a job. If anybody's interested in talking about that, please see me after my presentation. So the focus of this talk is, as I said, best practices for WordPress. A lot of the things that I'm going to talk about are pulled from the 10up engineering best practices. This is a screenshot of those. I have a link at the bottom. 10up, as I said, we're the biggest WordPress-centric agency in the world, and our best practices are pretty popular in terms of WordPress best practices. So definitely check those out. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is caching. So what we recommend is using Redis as a persistent object cache. WordPress by default does not enable any sort of persistent caching, but it does provide you with an API for dropping in various caching layers. You can drop in a custom object cache. I'm sure most of you know, but Redis lets you store things in memory for fast read and writes. It also offers built-in failover features that make it pretty useful, which is why we use it over something like memcached. At the bottom, I have a link to a WordPress plugin that we often use for using Redis on our WordPress projects. In terms of page caching, if you don't know, it's just the act of storing an entire page's output as HTML into cache. This lets you avoid all database queries entirely and makes it so you can serve web pages extremely quickly. We use very often a plugin called Batcache, which is a page cache drop-in. I have a link to that at the bottom. Fragment caching, this is storing fragments of the page, compiled HTML directly in cache. This is useful in a WordPress application when you're running a separate query for some piece of data, some part of the page. For example, like a featured post carousel would probably use like a WP query to pull in a bunch of posts. We would probably fragment cache that piece of the page in itself. Remote calls, obviously any sort of blocking remote call can be a huge performance bottleneck. So we want to cache those remote calls as long as we possibly can and utilize non-blocking requests whenever we can. So this is a good one as well. Priming the cache. A lot of times people will make the user sort of wait as cache is primed. That works, but on an enterprise WordPress application where you might be receiving hundreds of thousands or millions of page views, it's good to prime cache asynchronously. There's a lot of different ways to do this. We have a project at the bottom, it's called Async Transients. This uses a couple cool PHP features to basically continue executing PHP after data has already been sent to the user. There's cron you could use, there's Ajax, job queues, so there's a lot of different ways you can prime cache asynchronously. Admin-ajax.php, a lot of times in sort of basic WordPress projects, you'll see people querying data from admin-ajax.php. This is fine, but this is really for admin use only. It's not to be an API to be used on the front end. WordPress has a REST API to use, and if you're using this on the front end, you're querying an uncached API, which could become a huge bottleneck for your application. So off-the-shelf caching plugins, I'm a big fan of using mostly just sort of drop-in solutions. The off-the-shelf plugins oftentimes come bloated with a million different options, overly complicated. A lot of times they make a lot of edits to your file system, WP config, other things that can be difficult to remove if you want to remove one of these plugins. So I would highly encourage people to check out the simple drop-ins that I linked to earlier in my slides. Okay, so database reads and writes. This one I think is pretty obvious. We want to avoid front-end writes as much as possible. Database writes are slow. You can have race conditions. If you are utilizing something like bat cache for page caching, and you have users who aren't logged in, page caching makes those front-end writes unreliable. People who are receiving cache pages aren't going to be doing those writes. So you just have to be really thoughtful of how you're building your application when it comes to writing data on the front end. So WP query, for those that don't know, the WP query class is basically like the WordPress API for querying custom post types. So it is very, very highly used. There are a ton of different parameters that you can pass to WP query, and most people don't know what a lot of those parameters do. There's some of those parameters are very important for performance. So just to touch on a couple, so no found rows. If you set this to true, WordPress isn't going to pass in SQL calc found rows. SQL calc found rows slows things down. It is required for pagination, but if you're not using pagination, you don't need that. Update post meta cache and update post term cache. If you're not using the terms and meta associated with what you're querying, you just don't need these. And they are going to slow things down, so you can set those to false, and WP query won't prime those caches. Fields, setting fields to IDs. This is useful when only post IDs are needed, which is honestly most of the time. It avoids a lot of extra data preparation. Always set posts per page to a reasonable number. Setting post per page to -1, basically just a no limit SQL query, is dangerous. If this is used incorrectly, it could, crash your application. So always set some sort of reasonable limit. Post not in is just a MySQL not in query, which is just a slow query. Try to avoid that when you can. Just an example of what that might look like, passing all those parameters to the WP query. Another not well-known feature of WordPress is option autoloading. So update option and add option, they actually take a third parameter, and that's autoload. When autoload is set to true, on every page load, those options are going to be pulled from the database automatically. I often find that for most of the things that I'm building, my options aren't needed to be pulled from the database automatically on each page load. So setting autoload to false is the right move. Autoload is true by default. So this can save you a lot of time. I know I've worked on some large WordPress projects where you have tens of thousands of options. So job queues, if you're doing anything intense with like remote API calls, maybe you're ingesting content or creating like some sort of complicated report, something like that, anything that's probably going to take longer than a few seconds to complete, it's probably best to use a job queue. We have a solution called WP Minions. I have a link to that at the bottom. WP Minions is basically a job queue wrapper. It works with RabbitMQ. It works with Redis. So this will let you create a queue that can work separately from your application to do sort of heavy work. Search and complex queries. So Elasticsearch and ElasticPress. Elasticsearch, everybody probably knows, is a really popular open source database solution that makes search super easy and fast. ElasticPress is 10up's sort of Elasticsearch wrapper for WordPress. So if you're using WordPress and you want to use Elasticsearch, ElasticPress is definitely the way to go to use those together. ElasticPress empowers you to execute complex queries really fast. So for WordPress, that means like multi-dimensional taxonomy queries, multi-dimensional meta queries, other queries like that. If you're querying multiple taxonomies across multiple terms, like you quickly add up the number of table joins that you're going to have to do to complete that query. It just becomes like totally impossible to do that in a performant way. It's either going to take down your database or your user's going to have to wait forever. It's just a bad move. Elasticsearch and ElasticPress lets you do those types of queries very, very fast. So I have a link to that project at the bottom. Also, of course, ElasticPress is a toolbox that you can use for just really improving the search experience. With ElasticPress, you can search associated terms, you can search meta, author, you can do things like auto-suggest, geolocation, custom content weighting of different fields. So there's just a lot of powerful ways that you can enhance the search experience for your application. So let's talk about maintainability and stability in WordPress. So it is my point that maintainable code, it improves stability. When we build applications that are easily maintainable and extendable, those applications are likely less susceptible to bugs. When bugs do occur and our code has been written in a maintainable way, they're quicker to solve for our teams. It's much easier to add new features to maintainable code bases. And as we all know, if you're a developer in this room, engineers are just more productive when they're working on a code base that has been taken care of and is maintainable and extensible. So WordPress, as you guys know, especially at like a PHP conference, is built using a lot of old technologies. It's a super legacy platform. WordPress is deeply devoted to backwards compatibility. As such, it currently is compatible with PHP 5.2.4, which went end of life many, many years ago. Funny enough, WordPress 5.2 is going to up the minimum PHP version of 5.6, which I think is also end of life or about to be end of life. So it's okay. So WordPress and its decision to maintain that backwards compatibility, I mean, we could argue about that all day. Doesn't really matter. My point of this slide is that your project does not need to be constrained by whatever minimum PHP constraints WordPress imposes. So when we build modern WordPress applications, we're very much using PHP 7, whatever the latest 7.2, 7.3 is. We are very much using all the features, composer, traits, and namespace, all that stuff, very much like a modern PHP application. Those are how we build our plugins, our themes, our things around WordPress. So that's what you should do. MVC, model view and controller, it's a great pattern. It's used in a lot of important frameworks. WordPress is not MVC. It's not really object-oriented in a real sense. We find that forcing our applications to be MVC often just leads to a really confusing code base because WordPress is just not MVC. So this sort of lends to different design patterns. Don't try to force MVC if it's not the right fit for your project. We group distinct pieces of functionality into feature plugins. We find this simplifies deployments, it simplifies development, it lets engineers work on different plugins and not be clashing and building sort of like a monolithic application. We then opt into the usage of those plugins through hooks. That prevents us from getting into a situation where it's like, if this plugin's not active, the site fails, but like you have to activate plugins in like kind of like a weird order to make sure your site works. Opt into functionality through the usage of hooks, group functionality of feature plugins. That is the way to go. Documentation, of course, like for a maintainable code base, we want everything to be properly documented. I have the WordPress PHP documentation standards. There's also the JavaScript documentation standards. Both those links are up there. Wrapping wrappers. So a lot of times I see people doing this in their WordPress applications. WordPress has a very rich, easy to use API. Provides you with ways to create posts, enqueue scripts, send HTTP requests, all sorts of things. A lot of times I see people create these WordPress applications where the first thing they do is create like classes that wrap all these functionality into like their own API. I don't see the point in that sort of workflow. It just makes your application more complicated, and it makes it so anyone who's working on your application then has to like learn your custom API for enqueuing scripts. It just doesn't add anything. Don't wrap wrappers. So testing is great for code stability and maintainability. Unit tests, we all know what unit test is, I think. 10up has a project, WP mock. I have a link up there. WP mock lets you mock WordPress actions, hooks, functions, so you can unit test your code properly. Check that out. Acceptance tests, I think, are super important. We have a project we've recently released called WP Acceptance, which is a acceptance testing framework for WordPress. It's really, really powerful, really interesting. Works in your CI pipeline. Definitely check that out. We find that tests improve quality and stability and help us identify issues and just overall decrease like the regression of the code base and bugs that we push to production. So linting, we enforce linting rules on our code base to make sure our code is clean. We have our PHPCS rule set, which is based off like the WordPress standard PHPCS rules. Link is up there. We also have our own ESLint config, which is based off a variety of rules. Check that out as well. Linting is super important. So we do manage dependencies with Composer, just like a sort of modern PHP application should. You can, with WordPress, manage plugins, themes, and actually WordPress itself with Composer. We find this to be super useful. It forces updates to plugins, themes, and WordPress to be deliberate and make sure that production and all the developers are running the same versions of everything. As part of this, we disable plugin installing and updates through the WordPress dashboard. We don't want people doing that. We don't want people breaking production, updating and installing things on the fly. This is touched on in our engineering best practices, and there's a link to that at the bottom. So that kind of looks like this, where we have a Composer file in the root of our project. We have a WordPress configuration file. So that WordPress directory is automatically created by Composer, and then Composer manages plugins and themes in those directories. So this is different. You don't see this as much in WordPress, but this is how we do it, what we find works best. All right, so let's talk about security for WordPress applications. So whenever we are inserting data into the database, we want to make sure that data is validated, sanitized, cleaned. Make sure we strip anything harmful before it goes into the database. So WordPress out of the box gives us a variety of sanitization functions. I just have some examples up here. So sanitize text field is a way to sanitize data. We're using that on meta that we're inserting in the database with update post meta. And then below that, I have an example of us sort of validating data. So if we get a specific post variable, just setting true in the database, otherwise just deleting the post meta. The key to that is not actually passing that unsanitized user input variable directly to the database, because update post meta doesn't do any sort of sanitization out of the box. So just like we want to make sure input is clean, we want to secure all output. So this means escaping data that is printed to the screen. We want to escape data as late as possible. WordPress has a ton of functions for escaping output. I have a link to the WordPress Codex page on this at the bottom. Nonces, and WordPress is just a little bit different than what a nonce is typically, but a number that's used only once. We want to ensure that database modifications or other sort of important actions are done by who is supposed to be doing them and done and not sort of replayed. So there are a number of WordPress functions out of the box that can help us accomplish this. WP create nonce, WP verify nonce, and WP nonce field. So just an example, we have a form. WP nonce field outputs all the nonce fields that we need to then validate. And then when we're processing the data from that form, we're calling WP verify nonce to make sure that that data is from the person that it should be coming from, and that that action already hasn't been completed by the user. Limiting login attempts, this is super important. We want to limit the maximum number of login attempts to prevent bots from password guessing. Similarly, we want to require strong passwords. We all know weak passwords. It's one of the most exploitable parts of a web application. There are a number of plugins that do this for WordPress, but requiring users to create strong passwords is absolutely important. So third-party code, I think one of the biggest criticisms, whether valid or not, of the WordPress ecosystem is that there's like the plugin landscape is like the wild, wild west. Like you have here, I have over 40,000 community plugins. I'm sure that number is much higher at this point. Those plugins are written, some of them are professionally written by professional companies like Google or Facebook, and then some of those plugins are written by just some kid, you know what I mean? So you just don't know what you're getting. Plugins are reviewed before they're submitted to that repository. Plugin revisions are not really reviewed, and the review guidelines really are not geared for, is this a performant, secure plugin? The review guidelines are more like, is this an abuse of guidelines, or is this person trying to, hack people's websites? Like those are more like what the reviews are for. So we do review plugins and dependencies that we include in our WordPress applications. Some of that's automated, some of that is developers actually doing manual reviews of those plugins. We just want to make sure we know what we're using and we're using trusted code for obvious reasons. Same thing with the themes. If you're using a community theme, there are actually more stringent guidelines for those themes than there are for plugins. But again, like people are not reviewing those themes for, is it going to work well on a high traffic website? There's no sort of performance budget or anything like that. So you have to absolutely be careful and review what you're using. So teams. At 10 up, just like pretty much everywhere else, we use version control and make sure we have code history. And for that, we use GitLab. We mandate a workflow at the start of every project to keep the entire team on the same page. We have our sort of entire workflow in detail at that link at the bottom. It is very much a Git flow-esque workflow with some slight modifications. But that is very much how we do it at 10up. Internal code reviews internal code reviews are a very important process of how we build applications at 10up. We find that this improves performance, security, maintainability, and scalability for the applications we build. Engineers who review code improve their skills because they're reviewing others' code, and the engineers who are receiving those reviews learn from the reviews they get. So everybody sort of gets better as a team, and it makes our application better. We want to make sure that all code that is pushed to a application is reviewed by someone who didn't write the code. Continuous integration is an important part of how we do things at 10up. Like I said, we use GitLab, and we use a variety of tools with GitLab for continuous integration. But in GitLab terms, when a merge request is open against master, those changes are tested automatically. Unit tests, acceptance tests, syntax error. There's like a WordPress vulnerability database. We can compare all the plugins that you've listed in like your composer.json and reference those to the vulnerability database to see if there's any major flags for the versions that those plugins are using. We even do like virus scans, so we can do all that via GitLab and continuous integration. A tool that we use that I find is very useful is WP Snapshots. I have a link to this in our GitHub below, but this is a tool that sets up teams to easily share code bases. So anyone knows when you're working on a team, like getting everybody on the same local development environment with the same test data can be super difficult. This tool kind of solves that for you automatically and makes sure that everybody locally is using the exact same database, the exact same file system, and it's just a couple command line commands to do that. So this is super, super useful. And that is all I have. All right, thank you. So I will open it up for questions. I'm honestly not even sure. I'd have to look at our CI pipeline to see the exact tool we use for virus scanning. I can get back to you. The question, and I'm going to repeat the question. So for acceptance tests, the question is, what do we do for acceptance tests? We use WP Acceptance, which works off of Puppeteer. Yeah. I also have all the slides I did post on Twitter. I'll tweet them out again. They're on my website, taylorlovett.com. So you can grab links from there. Other questions? Hold on, back there, sorry. Yep.
So it's just us not to use the admin-ajax on the front end, yes? So we should use only REST API?
Yeah, so the question was, is the suggestion not to use admin-ajax on the front end? Yes, unless you absolutely need to do that.
For example, if I need to make the search filter, for example, yes, so I should query the results with API request.
Yeah, if you're doing like a search filter, like you said, like absolutely you would need to hit the REST API. That would make the most sense, because then the next person who queries those same filters is going to get a cached response. Yeah. Mustafa?
How do you manage the server deployment on the best practice?
Deployment?
Server deployment on your build pipeline? Is happening automatically, or
So the question is, I guess, what are our best practices around deployment? That really depend on the client, and that some people want more of like a continuous deployment, whereas a lot of times we'll have deployments set up for like Tuesdays or something like that. So pretty much we'll use continuous integration to merge things into master, and then probably on Tuesday we would do some final rounds of testing and click like a deploy button in GitLab. Yep.
I find the worst aspects of WordPress currently that there's no such like created list of plugins and themes. So since you are reviewing them before using them, do you have like does 10up have something like a created list of plugins that we can use?
So the question is, does 10up have a like public list of good plugins and themes to use? The answer to that is no, because, and this could change in the future. The answer to that is no, because once we publish a list like that, all the people that aren't on that list then want to know why they aren't on that list, and it becomes a whole thing. Also, that list, all we can do is reference specific versions of something. Like we can't say this plugin is good forever, because you could push a change tomorrow that we don't like. So then we have to, it becomes a little more complicated than just a list of plugins. Yes? Yeah, we absolutely use Varnish in some projects. Sorry, the question was, is for high traffic, is Varnish a better choice than what we were showing you with page caching? Sometimes we find that Varnish is the best option. We've served websites that receive 1 million+ page views a day with what I've shown you in the slides. But I think Varnish is absolutely a great tool as well. Yes? Do we build any what on top of WPs? Yeah, so the question is, do we use WordPress CLI? Yeah, absolutely. I mean, pretty much all like tools we've mentioned are CLI based, use WP CLI in some form or fashion. Absolutely. Yep. The question was, for migrations between environments, do we do this manually or do we have some sort of automated tool? So for migrations, a lot of that would be WP CLI, WP CLI export, WP CLI search and replace. I think a lot of that's manual. I mean, there are some tools that start that process for you. We do those manually. I'm not a huge fan of having like a UI for doing the migration. It just makes me uncomfortable if something breaks. Like I want to be in there playing with the data and making sure everything looks correct. Yes, we do. I think WP CLI has like a flag that it's able to do it properly and serialize data. Might be wrong, but I'm pretty sure it does. With the WP search replace command. Somebody, yep. So the transient, the question was, is the transient API enough, I guess? The transient API, the way it works is if there is an object cache, it'll store the transient in the object cache, but if there's not, it'll store it in the options table. So the options table works for like a low traffic website, but for a high traffic website, we need to store things in memory and in an object cache. So the transient API alone is not sort of the solution. It's like, I guess, more how we use it. But it still needs to be used in conjunction with like page caching or varnish or something to that effect. Yep. Is it safe to delete the transients? It should be. I mean, if it's not, that means somebody built something improperly, because when a transient's not available, it should be regenerated. But then you do get back to like, then the next person who visits the website's like, all those caches are then going to be primed at once, and that could lead to like some timeouts or something like that. Yes. We use, for database drop-ins, I think we use HyperDB. What's that? I don't know. I have to get back to you on that one. Any more questions? Okay, I know I'm supposed to ask like a test question for this. Let me think. So in terms of the WP query API for my slides, does anybody remember, maybe this is too hard, does anybody remember the parameter to pass when you don't need pagination and want to improve performance? Yep. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, that's pretty close, so. All right, I think you got it. What's your name? Albert, okay. Congratulations, thank you. All right, that's all, thank you.